To begin with, it is a toy and an amusement. Then it becomes a mistress, then a master, and a tyrant. The last phase is just that as you are about to be reconciled to your servitude, you kill the monster and fling him to the public. Thank you, Ron, for all the good deeds you've done.
Thank you, Elma. And now, our guest, Ron Wheatley.
Jim, am I supposed to hold this? Okay. Don't worry about this one. Just this one. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for. I'm always happy to come here, and thank you for honoring me with an invitation to speak about my book, A Time for War. And I know many of you. I think most of you. I do want to just single out. That, as you all know, we have a Gold Star parent here. And Joe, you want to say anything? I was just going to add that I dedicated the book to his son, Sergeant Michael Kelly, and a Marine who was killed in training in Parris Island.
Thank you, Ron. Karen and I spent hours with Ron just going over one of the chapters that Ron wrote about Michael. So it's an interesting read, the whole book, but really means a lot to us that Ron thought so much about Michael and what Michael stood for that he devoted a book and a chapter to Michael. We're coming up to Memorial Day. And Memorial Day is probably the most misunderstood holiday. Memorial Day is for the soldiers that are still wearing the uniform and they're not home. Veterans Day is for the veterans that wore their uniform and they're still with us. We're coming up next Saturday, the Patriot Day, and that's to honor the folks that are in the military currently. So again, a lot of people don't realize that. They say have a happy Memorial Day, but my family cannot have a happy Memorial Day because every day is Memorial Day for us. Thank you, Ron.
Let me get a picture of the book.
Thank you, Joe. So I'd like to, I just put out an outline. I'm not going to read all this, but just to, most people are interested in learning about the process of writing a book and, of course, the substance. And thank you, Eleanor, for your kind remarks. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the process of what I did. I don't recommend this to anybody else. It may work for you, it may not. I don't know if you're so inclined, if you want to write a book or not. But what I did was, I started probably about 30 years ago, not long after I got here in Scituate. Am I coming through okay? Can you hear me? I just thought, well, I'd like to interview local veterans. And so at that time, there were quite a few World War II veterans around Scituate, and they were fairly well. Most of them could be interviewed and could articulate pretty well. Hearing was a problem with some, but in any event, that was the idea. And I did the first one, and I thought, well, maybe I should send this to the Mariner, and maybe they would be interested. And so I sent it to the editor, and in my acknowledgments in the book, I mentioned all the editors that helped me at the Mariner, and there were, over that period, there were quite a few. But so that I started a column, basically. It's called Calling All Veterans. And each, maybe once every 2 months, they would publish, and I would write an article and they would publish it. And most of the veterans you would know, but many of them are gone now, as I said, the World War II ones. And so that was the process, and you'll notice that the articles are about 1,800 to 2,000 words, and the reason for that is when you're writing for a newspaper.
Can we give that out?
Pardon? Oh, sure, you can pass. We have a few examples here if you want to look at them. I don't know if I have Steve's there, but well, that one of them is. But so you're limited when you're working with an editor to usually about 800 words, but they were kind to me and they allowed me to do 1,800 words, up to 1,800 words, just because it's hard to render much in 800 words, unless you're a really good writer, and I'm not that good of a writer. But in a little bit about my background, came to Scituate in 1986, right, Ethel? And I was always interested in writing as a kid. I was blessed that I had an English teacher who was my uncle. His name was Reverend Ronald Heron, S.J. He was a member of the Society of Jesus, a Jesuit. And so I went to a Jesuit school, Gonzaga High School. And he encouraged my writing. When I was 13 years old, he handed me a book and he said, read this. And it was Ben-Hur, so that was a challenge. And I read it. And I actually understood it. I was pleased to know that I could follow it, and I think he was pleased as well, because he always asked for a book report. And after I majored in English in college, and so I was blessed with a good education. And like all of you, probably, we all had one good teacher who helped us. And with me, it was my uncle. And so that is a blessing, and I appreciate it. So when I got out of college, I had majored in English, and I joined the Peace Corps. Kennedy was president, and I went into the Peace Corps. I was in Nigeria, West Africa, which at that time, interestingly enough, was considered the great opportunity for democracy in Africa, because every fifth person in Africa lives in Nigeria. And now, of course, it's turned into Boko Haram. And it's been pretty much that history has gone downhill, unfortunately, ever since we were there. I don't think we were the cause, but some might debate that. But I taught English in an African school in Nigeria, in the Muslim region, lived with the Muslims, and I was always respected, treated well, but you had to be careful where you went. So when I came back from Nigeria, I thought, well, I'll teach in an American school. So I got a job at a inner city public school in Tacoma, Washington. And they thought, the administration thought, well, if he can go to Africa and he can teach there, he can do anything. He is, very, we can challenge him with anything. Well, they did, and I found out that Africa had spoiled me for teaching in America, because it was a totally different experience. Talk about cultural shock, believe me, that was cultural shock. Because in the Islamic tradition, teachers get great respect. And you can imagine being in a junior high school in the inner city, and suddenly kids are throwing knives at you, kitchen knives, nothing sharp, just from the cafeteria. So anyway, when I came back, I decided, well, I'm going to volunteer for the draft. After I finished my contract, they offered me a new contract. I said, no thanks, I'm going to volunteer for the draft, and I did. And I went to Vietnam for 2 years, and with the Army, I was drafted. And when I came back, I decided, well, what am I going to do now? I got the GI Bill. And so I decided that I either wanted to be a journalist or I wanted to be a lawyer. I wasn't sure which. And so I got a job with the Associated Press in Spokane, Washington. They had what they call a correspondency. They had two newspapers there. And the Associated Press would take the articles from the that were written during the day and during the night from those two papers and put it out on the wire. And that was my job. I was kind of like a rewrite man. But I learned how to write simple declarative sentence, make it pithy, make it short, who, when, where, you know, the regular journalistic skills required. And so but that was a part-time job, and so then law school was starting that next fall, and I decided, well, I'm going to go to law school, which I did. So that's how I became a lawyer. But the reason I mention that is part of the process of learning how to write and writing. And after you do it for a while, you get so that you like it, you enjoy it, and you want to do it. So that got me into writing my first book. My first book was based on my experiences in Africa. It's called A Song of Africa. And I wrote it 30 years ago, and I still get royalties on it, believe it or not.
That's good.
And it was published. I didn't self-publish it. They didn't have self-publishers back then. But later on, the publisher that published it went out of business. And so I wanted to keep it alive, so I put it on Amazon. And so it's still out there. It's available. Then my second book is called Trial of Phyllis Wheatley. And I did that a few years ago. And basically, it was a play that was produced at Bridgewater State College about someone who may or may not be related to me, to my family. I'm still researching that part, but it's about a slave girl. True story of a trial that took place in Boston. And I've talked to some of you about this before, but I don't want to go into it in any depth, but who was rescued by the Wheatley family, who were very prominent in Boston. And Mrs. Wheatley was a devout Congregationalist. In 1762, the ship had come in. The ship was called the Phyllis. It was in July of 1762. Came in from Africa, and Mrs. Wheatley went down to the Beach Street Wharf, which at that time was Beach Street. It's all landfill now, where the ship originally came in. And so she basically she didn't want to get enslaved. Her husband thought she should have a strong woman to help her, and so she accommodated him, went down there, looked around, and she saw this little kid. Apparently they lined the slaves up at that time. There's two stories, one that was at the slave store, one that was on the ship. I like the ship part. That's the way I kind of did it in my play. And she basically rescued the child, and when they got her home, they had twins, adult twins, teenagers actually, well educated, and they named her after the ship, Phyllis. And then she became the first American slave girl to be a published poet. And so that is a different story, but I did want to mention it because it's part of my writing career. This is the latest book, Trial of Phyllis Wheatley, Time for War, which was published in January of this past year, or this very year. And what it is those stories that I was telling you about that I put together from a compilation of all the newspaper articles that I'd written. And I can read you a few tidbits from it. I can tell you that I got 3 Litchfields in here. Franny, Steve's dad, who was a worked on Liberator bombers flying the hump from China to India, or from India to China, back and forth, going over the Himalayas. And I got Steve, and Steve underplays his story, but this story is very interesting. It's one of those. Well, I guess it didn't become declassified until a few years ago, really.
It's on the internet now.
It's one of those really. I think you'll find it.
USS Wright brothers.
And he was like one of the few people in the country that actually knew how to use a computer, because he went to RPI, right? And pardon?
The Navy taught me they did.
No, but you had the technical background, and your dad was what, the best mechanic in town. Everybody seemed to say that. And then Steve's brother Doug is in there. He was in Vietnam about the same time I was, and he had a very rough time, and he had a rough time coming back. But he's doing well now, and has his own landscape business. So that's part of the Scituate tradition, by the way, of families. You know, some people contribute more than others, and some families, you know, have generations that can. Even my own family, I'm not bragging, but my great 6 generations back grandfather, Leonard Wheatley, who I wrote up in the book, served on the Continental Line with George Washington at Yorktown. So I'm able to become a son of the American Revolution, but more important, I got my daughter in the DAR, thanks to Joan. Joan helped me out with that. And my son's also in the SAR. Pardon? Anyone? And feel free to speak up if you have any questions. But it's hard for me to read from the book and hold this microphone, so I don't know if you'll be able to hear me, or can I put it here? Is this one dead?
It won't fit.
Oh, it won't fit. Well, I maybe I put it there. Does that work? Well, that might. Yeah. Can you hear it? Okay. All right. Good. I thought I'm not going to take a lot of time here, but I thought that I might read a couple of tidbits from some World War II veterans that I was honored to actually get to know through this process. And one of them was Mary Reagan Quessenberry. Did any of you know her? Okay. Yeah.
That's how I found out about her. Meals on Wheels.
Okay, all right. Well, she's a really wonderful person, a very fascinating story. In World War II, well, first of all, before World War II, she was born in Boston, and her father was pretty prominent. Her mother was as well, and she had some very fine education. She graduated from Radcliffe with a master's degree in art, and her parents took her all around the world. And actually, on her own, she went to Paris and she studied at the Louvre and got to know a lot of artists. And so along comes World War II, and she's over there, and she's got to get out of there. She comes back home, and the reason she's coming back home, obviously, is because the Germans are coming to France, and the other part of it was that both of her brothers, who were physicians, young physicians, had volunteered to join the army, and both of them found themselves in Bataan, of all places. And so she felt, well, gee, I got to do something. So she came back, and she joined the WWII. And at that time, a theme of her story is that there was a lot of discrimination against women in the WWII. I don't know if any of you experienced that, but in fact, they call it at that time, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, the WAACS. So she trained at Fort Des Moines, and here she was, an artist. What are we going to do with her, So they sent her back to Boston and made her a recruiter, which she did. She did a good job, but she was desperate to get to Europe. And so she pulled some strings somehow, and she got orders to go to Europe. And she ended up, her first job was she was sent to the headquarters in England of the British bombing and the 8th bombing squadrons that were bombing Germany. And her job was to do bomb damage assessment and working with maps and things that were visually, graphic and needed interpretation. And so after these bombing runs, they'd send these reconnaissance P-38, Spitfires, whatever, over the area that had been bombed, and they'd take pictures. And the next day, she'd be doing the bomb damage assessment, and then they'd decide whether or not they're going to. That would actually directed the next raids, whether or not they were successful or not, and not whether they had to go bomb again or whatever. So she ended up in 1945, when the war was over, with a Bronze Star, because and she always said to me, the Bronze Star that I got should have gone to some soldier in a foxhole at the stone, in the Battle of the Bulge. That's how modest she was. But the interesting thing also is that I consider her America's first monument woman. We've seen the movie, The Monument Men, read the book. Well, that's what she actually got involved with. And she spent, say, like 46 to 48 doing assessments of structures in Europe, going into salt mines looking for stolen art. Just fantastic. If you saw the movie, you can get a sense of what it was like. But she doesn't get much credit. I've never seen her name written up as a monument woman. And so she was one of the World War II people that I interviewed, who I had a lot of fun getting to know, and I really enjoyed that, and I learned a lot. And these World War II veterans can teach us a lot. Another one was, we got to put the mic down here. Was Charlie Schnell. And Charlie Schnell, you used to see him on Memorial Day on the Common. He'd be sitting in one of the folding chairs. He had big hearing aids on, and he wore his Eisenhower jacket, which had the patch, the famous patch, Hell on Wheels, which was, as probably all know, Patton's Third Army. And so he was drafted, and he ended up in Europe 3 days after D-Day with his tank and his crew. And they were then on the road all the way to Berlin, following Patton as he raced across Europe. And it was, let me just read you a little bit of how he described it. He was in a Sherman tank. You all know, probably seen pictures of Sherman tanks, but they were small. They weren't anything compared to the German tanks. I mean, they were undergunned and underweight and vulnerable. So in my interview I said, but Hell on Wheels goes both ways. This is, I'm quoting him now. The tanks were hot in the summer and cold in the winter. When we were in the tank most of the time, and we were in the tank most of the time, we just kept moving night and day. We kept to the main roads. And when we first came upon a bridge, this is the very first time they came upon a bridge, one of the tanks ahead of us started to cross and fell through. After that, we were ordered no more crossing bridges on the road. Go down the bank of the river, cross the river, and come back up the other side of the bank, you get back on the road. And from what I've read about Patton's army, it was really very disciplined and much more than your average unit. So I can imagine the drills that they had to go through. And then he goes on to say that Schnell recalls the top speed of a Sherman tank was 28 miles an hour. And along the way there was shelling and all that stuff going on. We used to deliver the gas by truck, and we would use 5-gallon containers to fill her up. It took 2 men, one to pour and one to stand by with a fire extinguisher. We got only about 2 miles to the gallon, and the tank had a 200-gallon tank. And ergonomic considerations that we take for granted now did not exist then. That was my statement. But this is what he said. He said the tank had a radial-cooled, air-cooled airplane engine. And when you were inside the engine going and the hatches open, the suction practically sucked the clothes off your back. We were sitting on the engine, and it was so loud, as was the cannon. We closed the hatch to fire the cannon in the turret. When we fired the 75mm cannon, the tank would roll back about a foot. The breech of the cannon would open inside, and the red-hot 39-pound shell was ejected upon us. We had helmets and earphones most of the time, and we kept the German infantry running from us. Our targets were also German tanks. At night, we were sometimes attacked by German planes. I ran over a mine one time and blew off a track, but we fixed it. So that gives you a little idea of what it was like to be inside that particular model. There were, would you believe, 5 guys in that tank. Everybody was cross-trained, but it's probably inside is smaller than not much bigger than a 4-door sedan, but much more uncomfortable. So that we have a submariner with us tonight. This gentleman, what's your name, sir?
Malcolm Gale.
And you're from Marshfield, right?
That's correct.
I was telling him I have a couple of submarine stories in here. One of which is called Diesel Boats Forever, and it's about it's before the last patrols of World War II. And the submarines at that time were all diesel boats. There weren't any nuclear subs. And once the nuclear subs came in, I think there was this rivalry between, and you would know more than that, between the two units.
There were still diesel boats when I was in.
We
used to run close in up into the rivers in Vietnam.
Wow, that's interesting.
I ran into a friend in the Philippines who was on one of those, so that was a trip I wouldn't want to make.
So those were not submerged then when you were going?
Well, they would come up, yeah, and go in close to the rivers
Right.
and let off
Right.
the Navy SEALs and whatever else was going up into North Vietnam. So.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I didn't even know they had used submarines in Vietnam when I was there. Yeah, but I didn't get around boats. So what I did in the book was to start out with World War II, go on to the Korean War, and then go on to Iraq, Vietnam, and then Iraq, and then Afghanistan. So I try to bring it up to date. And in all those cases, I interviewed veterans involved. And so what I've done, I guess, is I've preserved a lot of memories from the grave. And for that, I feel that's an accomplishment. So I could, stand up here all night and talk about the stories, and I don't want to bore you with.
Not boring us at all.
Well, in any event, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer.
Well, Mary, the DAI adopted her. Mary Kingsbury.
Oh, they did?
The DAI adopted her, and the last time I saw her, she was in a nursing home over in Rockland, in the VS hospital.
Yeah, I didn't see her in the hospital because I hadn't seen her. I didn't see her after I interviewed her. I didn't see her a lot. So, but she did remain a friend.
And she was really with it, even when she was in nursing home.
Yeah.
She had her whole she always looked nice, that stuff.
Yeah, she was an attractive woman.
Oh, yeah.
And you can imagine her. She told me she had red hair when she was World War II, so I'm sure she was very stunning.
Ron, how long did it take you to pull this one together?
Well, this is a good question because JD, because there's two answers. One is 30 years, and the other one is a year. So from doing the interviews, it was a 30-year part. Putting it together was the year part. And I had help from people in Scituate. I acknowledge them in my acknowledgments. I try to include everybody that helped me. I acknowledge different organizations that have helped me. And the Rotary Club is mentioned in here, and at least one story, Kelly's story. And I guess that's about covers this.
So what are you working on now?
And we're working on that. I'm in that dark area of,
Dry spell.
it was T.S. Eliot, I think, that said, between the inspiration and the production falls the darkness. And I'm kind of in that valley. I always think, though, that, when you only have so much time, and as you get older, you don't have that much more time to write books. And if you're going to write a book, you got to get cracking on it. It's a race against the clock because it's a year project at least, and it's a total kind of dedication, devotion. Let me ask you here: anybody here want to write a book or have that desire?
Question.
Yes.
When you decide to write the book, do you set certain time of day every day? What's your schedule?
That's the proper way to do it. But you have to be disciplined to do that, and that requires. I've heard about writers that, like Hemingway, for example, you write in the morning, and drink in the afternoon, or whatever. But most writers successful writers are disciplined, and they set aside 3 hours at a minimum every day to write. Because once you do that, you keep going. And I guess I did do that pretty much in the final stages of all my books. It's just a question of getting to that point where you're ready to write. And some writers, like Michael Conley. You know Michael Conley? You've heard of him. He does all these wonderful books. He's probably the most successful writer living today. And he's got a tape out, a disc out that anyone can buy. I can get it online. And it's part of this Masters series. They interview celebrities that are really at the peak of their particular art, dance, acting. They had Dustin Hoffman, for example, and Michael Conley is, as I said, the most successful writer. So he has this wonderful series, and anyone should look it up if you're interested in ever doing any writing. It's $90, but it's worth it because he tells you exactly how he writes the book. And he's written, he's so prolific, it's unbelievable. But he's very, very disciplined. He talks about outlining. That's something that I had trouble with. But that's probably the best way to do it. So when my daughter designed the cover, my daughter Elizabeth, she designed the cover. She designed the covers of all my books. She's a graphic artist. It's kind of hard to see, but it's kind of conveys the idea of war, at least for some of us. It's like looks like World War I, but Vietnam was a lot like World War I. You know, sandbags and trenches, bunkers. I see we've been joined by our esteemed leader of the Post 144. Would you like to introduce yourself, sir?
My name is James Montana. I'm commander of the Post 144 American Legion.
Welcome.